types, these linguistic properties get shared in adjacent areas. Those of you who are interested in sociolinguistics, there's a very interesting social aspect to this, namely how do these properties get transferred? And one of the big things that's emerging, and I mentioned the name of Peter Trudgill quite a bit, Trudgill, who had a book a couple of years ago called Sociolinguistic Typology, and he's asking the question, what kind of contact situations, what kind of bilingualism situations lead to these transfers of linguistic properties across adjacent areas, often among, we know traditionally that in certain parts of the world, we talk briefly about the Balkans, where there's been a lot of exchange. They're still Indo-European languages, but different groups. In India, in the subcontinent, you've got Dravidian languages and Indo-European languages with strong inter-influence there, including word order features. And so, anyway, that's a good talk for you to hear. He's one of our own. He's doing a beautiful job. He's been invited to Berkeley to give a talk. I'll tell them all about it over there. So support your other students, support your department, and yes, so it's a really good thing to do. Now, we have quite a bit to do today. So Michelle, there's a little metathesis there. We need it's Trudgill, not Trudgill. Peter Trudgill. He's a very interesting guy. We are going to do some new stuff before the big event today, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to, which is our midterm. A number of you have had a separate session with Michelle, which was very useful then, and so it's really good. What we're going to do, obviously, before the final, we'll have another review. In between now and the final, Michelle and I were just talking. We'll have one of her weeks, instead of doing an office hour, she'll hold another sort of session just to clarify for those of you who are interested in that some of these points. Because some of the things we're doing here in this course are a little bit tricky. In fact, the word order stuff, the Matthew Dreyer paper is a bit tricky. Some aspects of Greenberg are. Relative clauses are also a little bit tricky, and we need to dissect that Keenan Comrie paper. Keep on talking about that today. Relative clauses are rather complex structures. That's what makes them typologically interesting, because whenever you have a certain complexity, there are different ways in which languages can realize this complexity. The basic point, remember, of a relative clause is that it's basically a sentence or a clause that modifies a noun. And these things are crucial. So we've got things like the book, which the professor wrote, is a clause, it modifies a noun. And in everyday communication, what's interesting about relative clauses is that normally when you get fairly complex structures with what are in effect embedded clauses, a clause within a clause, we try to avoid these as much as possible, but for communicative, for semantic reasons, you can't avoid using relative clauses, because if I want to tell you about a book that you don't know about, the only way I can do that is by really adding some description about it. I mean, it's no good most of the time just saying the yellow book or the linguistics textbook, that'll do it sometimes, but very often I want to identify the book which the professor wrote. And the only way to do that is to say it that way, to have a whole clause, so that the logic, if you like, the basic claim that's made about the world when we have sentences like this is something like, the book which is such that the professor wrote it. And it's no accident that Ed Keenan, who's one of the authors of this paper and is a faculty member at UCLA, their linguistics department. When I first encountered him, he was actually at the University of Cambridge, where I was, and he was just beginning his career, actually, there. And Comrie was also there. That's how they started their collaboration that lasted for many years. And it's no accident that Ed Keenan is a semanticist, and really a logician. He started out in philosophy and logic, and what intrigued him initially, the reason he got into typology, was because it was really these relative clauses, and he noticed, we're going to see this in a minute, there are many languages in the world that go around saying things like the book that the professor wrote it, and they have this nice little pronoun there that makes clear what the role of the head is in the relative clause. This is one of the things that's tricky about relative clauses that we have to just talk about. We've got to talk about the grammar, and then we see this played out in the typology, in the cross-linguistic variation, because the parameters of variation in a complex structure like this involve exactly the complexity of that structure. What languages will often do is insist on simplifying this complexity and not allowing certain options that other languages allow that permit more complex structures. So you've got some interesting variation patterns in terms of how productive these relative clauses are across languages, and we're going to see an interesting typology in terms of the possible variation patterns. The most straightforward one is the one we've already mentioned in word order, which I'll just repeat. That is the ordering of relative clause and head noun. So in a language like English, you've got the book preceding the relative clause. English is a noun rel language. We saw last time that certain other languages are rel noun. They put the relative clause. Japanese is an example. We had some on the handout. I've got extra copies of last week's handout. If you need them, if people need, I gave a couple of handouts. I've got some extra. Do you want additional examples? Put this on the board. This is the handout one. We got a bunch more for those of you who need them. I know very often the dog gets it, or the cat gets it, or the baby gets it, or somebody gets hold of it. And so in a language like Japanese, we've got this very interesting pattern exemplified in number one, the handout. So you've got the zoga is the subject of the whole clause, the elephant, nominative marker, subject marker, nade, ta, patted, pat, past tense. That's the main verb. So the elephant did some patting. What did the elephant, or who did the elephant, or what did the elephant pat? The elephant patted the deer, shika, o, accusative marker. So we've got the elephant patting the deer. And which deer are we talking about? We're talking about the deer that knocked down the giraffe. So there's the relative clause. And confusingly, and this, if you're not used to a language like this, it really takes a lot of getting your head around it, because we've already seen basic Japanese word orders are mirror images of the English. VO in English, OV in Japanese, prepositions in English, postpositions in Japanese, and now in the noun phrase, believe it or not, noun rel in English, rel noun in Japanese. And you also find that pattern in Chinese. We heard the Chinese sentence where you've got basically, so I have thrown away the book that you gave me, and book, and then the relative clause you give me, and then a nominalizing particle intervening between them. The same rel now, although we've got a particle now. We've got this particular particle that intervenes between them. In Japanese, you notice we don't have anything that occurs in between the relative clause and the head noun. We have what's often called a zero relativizer, a zero complementizer, no relative pronoun or anything like we have in English. I'll come back to talk about relative pronouns in a second. Here in this language, Telugu is a Dravidian language. It's like Tamil. And, it's one of these original languages from India. The Dravidian languages are very, very Japanese-like. They are rigid SOV languages. They have lots of properties that they share, interestingly, with Japanese and Korean grammatically. Here we have the relative preceding. So here we're giving something that the book that you gave me is torn. There's the head noun book. Michelle's put the N around it. That's the head noun. This is a fairly typical pattern in probably most rel noun languages, most pre-nominal languages. You have, so you've got literally miru, me, you, naku, me, and then we've got a form of the verbs, gloss, give, preterite, participle. And the crucial bit for a relative clause is this final little affix here, which signals subordinate status. That means it's not a main clause. So you've basically got the verb with a preterite marker, and that R is a bit like our complementizer. You know, I know that John is sick, the that subordinate complementizer. And very often what happens in these languages that have prenominal relatives is that you have some clear participial type or subordination marker like that. And the fascinating thing, we just go back to the Japanese for a second, is that in Japanese you don't get that. And the reason this sentence, I put this one up, it comes from a study that was done in Santa Barbara by a linguist, psycholinguist called Pat Clancy, who works a lot on Japanese and Korean. And she was very interested in the question, how do children learn these structures, and what kind of errors do native-speaking children make when they learn these different kinds of languages, in particular when they learn head-final languages. And some of the structures, you know, in all languages there are some things that are more complex and things that are less, that are easier. And in Japanese, what is very difficult for kids is exactly seeing a reflection of this fact that in Dravidian languages you've got some clear participial marker here, whereas in Japanese you don't. That form of the verb, taushita, is exactly what you could be getting in a main clause. It doesn't say carry on its sleeve the indication that it's subordinate. So notice that a child hearing zoga, kirino, taushita, could simply say, elephant, giraffe, knocked down. That means the elephant knocked down the giraffe. And she established that indeed they systematically make that error, and when children are quite young in Japan, they keep that error, and they often misunderstand these kinds of clauses, these complex things. And it's precisely because of the position of the relative clause, rel noun, and it's precisely because of the morphology that does not distinguish. So the main verb from the subordinate verb. And so she was interested in seeing to what extent this is a problem in acquisition, and it can establish that indeed it was. It takes them a while to get used to this kind of stuff. So these are some different subtypes of pre-nominal relatives in different languages. The most common is the Dravidian. Chinese is weird because it's just about the only subject-verb-object language in the world that has these pre-nominal relatives. And the thing to say about these pre-nominal relatives, most languages are like English. They like to have the head noun before the relative clause. They like to say the book, which the professor wrote, and that kind of thing. So, in fact, the distributional statement we can make is that it is almost exceptionlessly, apart from Chinese, it is almost always the case that you only get pre-nominal relatives in rigid verb-final languages. This is one of the characteristics of rigid verb-final languages. And even then, they all don't have the pre-nominal. So if you've got a non-rigid verb-final language, like Persian, like German, where you've got a lot of permitted postposing to the right of the verb, they almost never have pre-nominal relative clauses. So it's something, and to make sense of this, notice that if you've got a rigid verb-final language like Japanese, remember from Greenberg's Universal and Dreyer, if it's rigid, that means that pretty much all their phrases are head final, including the noun phrase. And the noun phrase is final because the relative clause precedes it. So the interesting thing is that if a language is going to move away from rigid to non-rigid across its grammar, one of the first things to hop over to the right of the head is the relative clause. And that's what we see is cross-linguistically a reflection of the fact that in general, People don't like pre-nominal relative clauses. They're hard to learn for children. They're hard to use. One of the, there's numerous typological details I could give. There's been a lot of work on these things, but let me just summarize it briefly. In general, we've got a restricted set of languages that allow pre-nominal relatives, only the rigid OV ones. There are all kinds of grammatical restrictions in these, typically in languages like Japanese and Dravidian and so on. They often have restrictions. You can't have certain auxiliary elements. You can't sometimes even have negation. You can't do, you have to have this participial thing. They're typically in language use rather short. They don't allow a lot of complexity within them. So there's all kinds of evidence about, from grammars and from actual usage and from acquisition, that these are not the best structures to have in your language. As I said, languages vary. Each language has some more and some less complex things. Within the rigid, but within the verb final languages, these are among the most complex things that speakers have to deal with, having noun phrases with pre-nominal relative clauses, and we see that reflected in all kinds of ways. Now, as far as we're concerned, we've got these basic types, these subtypes then of pre-nominal relative clauses. I've talked about some of the general difficulties of using them. In the Keenan Comrie article, they are facing the question, how are we going to typologize? How are we going to classify the diversity in relative clauses across languages? There's all kinds of things that vary. And their first big parameter is simply then ordering. Are you pre-nom or post-nom? Are you rel noun or noun rel? And as we've seen, about at least 75-80% of the world languages are post-nom, noun rel, and a subset of the rigid OV languages are rel noun. Now, so much for that. The second big parameter for variation that Keenan and Comrie give us is a slightly tricky one, slightly more subtle one that we have to spend a little bit of time talking about. And the basic intuition is this. A relative clause can be, in their terms, plus case or minus case. Plus case or minus case. What's the start of the basic intuition? Then let's see more precisely how they define it. The basic intuition is this. The basic intuition comes from languages that you may know and love, the German, the Slavic languages, Latin, Greek, all of these well-known Indo-European languages that have what we call the relative pronouns. Relative pronouns. Now, all the Indo-European languages pretty much have relative pronouns. In English, we even have some residual, well, we have relative pronouns like whom, the student who wrote the letter, the student whom I know. We even have a residual in English case marking, because in Old English, as in modern German, as in Russian, as in Latin, you have relative pronouns that are case marked. So these are very clearly plus case devices in Keenan and Comrie's terms. But the basic intuition that they have here is a bit more subtle, and it encompasses more things than relative pronouns. And in fact, what is typologically interesting is that across the languages of the world, these relative pronouns that we have are actually quite rare. It's almost only the Indo-European languages that have these kinds of relative pronouns. So let's just think for a moment. Think of them in English. Who, whom, whose is another one. Just look at the sentence and let's just play around with those for a little bit. When we have a thing like the professor who wrote the book, the professor whom I know. Notice what the relative pronoun is doing there in those dialects of English that still have this, because many dialects don't. I mean, certainly, I don't know about you, where I go around saying the professor who wrote the book and the professor who I know. We've pretty much lost the whom distinction in most dialects of modern English. But leaving that aside, let's pretend that we still have a productive who. What does that relative pronoun signal? Well, it's rather interesting. The professor who wrote the book, the professor whom I know. In the case of the whom, what the relative pronoun is telling me is, in the relative clause, this head noun professor plays the role of an object. And this, and there's a piece of background here. One of the things that makes a relative clause is that you have an identical occurrence of this head noun, this referent. You have an identical occurrence in the main clause and in the subordinate clause. The way we make relative clauses modify and tell you which book you're talking about, which professor you're talking about, is precisely because you have a paraphrase like, the professor who is such that I know him. you have that professor playing a grammatical role both in the main clause and in the subordinate clause. You have an identical occurrence, you have what's called co-reference, you have reference, and in a logical representation of these sentences within semantics, and this is what Keating was interested in, the translation, the logical translation of something like, the book which the professor, or the people with who the professor whom I know, is something like the Professor X, who is such that I know X. You have this X variable referring back to the professor in this logical translation that logicians give us for sentences like that. And so Keenan was fascinated by the fact that in many languages, we're going to see in a minute, Hebrew is one, many languages have a surface structure of exactly that kind. The professor that I know him or her, the students that I taught them. That's exactly what you say in Hebrew. And in many languages that are what we call pronoun retaining languages, that keep the pronoun. And the whole game that's being played here is a result of this fact that structurally, grammatically, and semantically, a relative clause involves a head noun which plays a role in its main clause and also plays a grammatical role in the subordinate relative clause. And this is what makes them so complex, even if you've got a post-nominal relative. The psychologists who work on English have shown that children find this aspect of keeping track of the referent extremely difficult in relative clauses. And one reason is that you could have a sentence like, I know the professor, okay, I subject verb, as the verb know, the professor object, and then we can have a relative clause. And in that relative clause, this same professor can play different roles grammatically than it plays in the main clause. So you can say, I know the professor who wrote the book. And in the relative clause, the professor is then the subject of writing the book, but he's the object of me knowing him in the main clause. So you have the professor being an object in the main clause, but a subject in the subordinate clause. And one thing that psychologists have shown, and we talk about acquisition problems that children find difficult with, they find it hard at first when they're learning relative clauses to figure out these different roles, to recognize that the professor can be 1 minute an object and the next a subject. And in fact, those of you who are psychology majors, done some psycholinguistics, some of the early studies on language acquisition, looking at relative clauses, came up with a pattern which they call parallel function. If you have, say, a sentence like, I know the professor that Bill knows, where the professor is object upstairs in the main clause and object downstairs, children find that much easier to process and to learn than if you mix the roles so that the professor is, say, object upstairs, I know the professor, and subject downstairs, who knows me. They find different grammatical roles hard to learn, whereas if the role of the professor in the relative clause is the same as the role of the professor in the main clause and has a parallel function, they found that children understood those far more readily, learned them more readily. So this is a piece of psychology, but it gets to the point that Keenan and Comrie are making now, which is crucial, is that one thing that languages have to do, different languages, is to make clear the role of the head in the relative clause, whether it's parallel or not. And one thing that languages with relative pronouns do very readily and easily, so if you know you're Russian or German or Latin and so on, you'll know that you've got a form of something like who nominative, whom accusative, whom dative. You've got different case-marked relative pronouns, and the case marking on the relative pronoun tells you exactly what the role of the professor is in that relative clause. And you may remember, just as we're looking at this, we have a second handout, which I also have extra copies of. If you need it from the Comrie chapter, just let's remind ourselves of the possibilities here. There's extra copies. This was handout number 2. I called it that I gave out last time. There's extra copies here. I understand that the dog may have chewed it, the baby may have been sick on it, and so on and so forth. So here we're looking, yes, we're looking, remember, Comrie is interested typologically in terms of different languages. He's looking at these kinds of sentences, these kinds of noun phrases. So, forgetting for the moment the role of the man in the matrix in the main clause, we've got things like the man who bought the book for the girl. The man is represented by who, is a nominative here in the relative clause. The man is the subject, is doing the buying, and stands in English in front of the verb, which subjects normally do. In fact, for English, one of the key indicators of who's doing what to whom in the relative clause is the position of the verb. So here, the man clearly is he's standing in the subject position. That's what the who does, even if there wasn't case marking. You can tell who's doing what to whom. The book which the man bought. Now here the book, this time we have a different relative pronoun. It's sensitive to the animacy of the who is for people and which is for things, basically. Which in English doesn't have any nominative accusative distinction. Traditionally in Indo-European languages, neuter forms do not have a nominative versus accusative distinctions. They collapse that. So this doesn't tell you, but then you can see clearly in this clause the book which the man bought. Clearly the man is the subject of the buying, and the book is the object of the buying. So here I put something. Here we are, to use the terminology, relativizing on a subject. That means that the head noun plays the role of subject in the relative clause. Here, the head noun book plays the role of object. We are relativizing on an object, to use the Keenan-Comrie terminology. If we can move down one more to the oblique, they also have an indirect object. They talk about that, but for many languages, there's not clear surface distinction between indirect objects and obliques. You can even see in English, we've got prepositions for the obliques very often. So they abandon that as a distinction, and now we have subject, object, oblique. The girl for whom the man bought the book. Okay, the man, subject, bought the verb. The book is the object here for this particular person, and we've got the for whom there. Yes, question?
Do we need to know the difference between oblique and indirect objects?
Sorry?
Do we need to know the difference between oblique and indirect objects?
Basically, in the Keenan-Comrie paper, yes, but then they abandon it later because it's not really systematic, and so for our purposes, we oblique will cover both indirect and oblique. And the grammar is a bit subtle. In general, if you've got an indirect object, that is the third argument of a verb. So that would be characteristic of a transitive, ditransitive verb. And we can also say in English, I gave John the book, I gave the book to John. We have two ways of capturing an indirect object. English is a language that has a nice, clear distinction then between indirect objects and other arguments. Now, these obliques cover a variety of possibilities. These are always typically noun phrases occur within prepositional phrases. Some of them are grammatically what we call subcategorized or required. So you could say, I put the book on the table. It's kind of incomplete to just say, I put the book. So you need that prepositional phrase on the table. In other cases, these prepositional phrases are just what we call adjuncts. They're kind of added on. John, ate his meal in the afternoon. Well, in the afternoon is also an oblique phrase, but it's a temporal adjunct here, and the sentence can be quite complete without it. So there's a lot of different stuff going on in the grammar of individual languages. For typological purposes, Keenan and Comrie just want they want to pull out a clearly identifiable class of things, and in some languages you've got a nice clean distinction between indirect objects and obliques. In other languages they're looking for all the words like the same as the adjuncts, and you can't differentiate them grammatically other than in terms of lexical types of prepositions or postpositions that they use. So that's why they simplify things. And then the last position, as we're going to see on this famous hierarchy, the accessibility hierarchy, the genitive, where we've got, here in English, we've got a nice different relative pronoun. The boy whose book, the man bought for the girl. So the man is the subject, the verb, the whole whose book is an object, but the whose is a possessive or a genitive. And okay, this is say that for a moment. Now, back to this notion of plus case, minus case. Here's how Keenan and Comrie define that parameter, that criterion. They're going to classify relative clauses and classify languages then according to two parameters. One is the relative ordering of noun and rel, as we've seen. The second is whether that language has relative clauses that are plus case or minus case. So we've got to define the difference. And the basic thing that they're trying to do here is to answer the question, how do grammars signal the role of the head noun in the relative clause? And we've seen that's the crucial thing that relative pronouns do. Grammars have to do that. These things are going to be unusable. They're going to be unusable and unlearnable unless the grammar clearly tells the user what the role of the head is in the relative clause, because that's what the semantics of relative clauses is all about. You've got a clause modifying a head to tell you which instance of the head you're talking about. You've got to make clear the relationship between that clause and the head. The way you do that is to have a shared referent, an identical occurrence, an X in the logical language, or co-reference, and so on. You have got to make clear what role that head is playing in the relative clause. So Keenan and Comrie's second criterion is we're going to classify relative clauses according to whether they have a plus case strategy or a minus case strategy. A plus case strategy means that the relative clause contains what they call a nominal element, some kind of nominal element, pronoun, noun, a nominal element in the relative clause that unequivocally expresses which noun, phrase, position is being relativized on. That's how they put it. So a nominal element that unequivocally tells you, in effect, what the role of the head is in the relative clause, whether it's a subject, whether it's an object, whether it's an oblique, whether it's a genitive. You get the picture? What role is this head playing? And what are the different devices that allow you to do that? Well, prototypically, the Keenan and Comrie, relative pronouns, like we have in Latin and Greek and Russian and German and all these kind of languages. However, typologically, they didn't know this at the time until they started looking. We now know those are extremely rare. It's almost only Indo-European languages that have what we would call relative pronouns. So let's just get the terminology straight. You know what pronoun? Pronouns are any proform that stands for a whole noun phrase. So typical pronouns are personal pronouns. He, she, it. IU. These stand for persons. These are what we call personal pronouns. Demonstrative pronouns. I want that. That and this are what we call demonstrative pronouns. So there's different kinds of pronouns, but relative pronouns are also pronouns. All languages in the world, this is an absolute universal, all languages have personal pronouns. Every single language has got some personal pronouns. They also have demonstrative pronouns, deictic. But very few languages have relative pronouns. And so what else is, in the event that you don't have relative pronouns, what are the other devices that Keenan Conway subsume under this plus case classification? Well, what other ways are there of having a nominal element that unequivocally tells you what position you're relativizing? Let's look on the handout, number 1, at the Hebrew example. Do we have speakers of Hebrew? Somebody must know Hebrew. Somebody must be a native speaker of Hebrew. Oh, boy. Okay, so anyway, here's the Hebrew example. We've got a relative number 4. This is going to translate the woman that John gave the book to. Now, in Hebrew, the head noun is on the left. It's a noun language. You've got a little particle or word, Haisha, the woman. So, like a little definite article. Now we come to the relative clause, and it begins with this, what most languages have actually, and most languages use in their relative clauses, are general subordinators or complementizers. Things, so most languages that have a relative clause will use some signaling element, some subordinating conjunction, like the English word that. I know that John is coming. And in fact, in English, if you think about it, we also have that option as well. We can say the students that the professor was teaching. We use this same that. It occurs all over the place. Some people call it a relative pronoun, but that's a bit sloppy because technically the relative pronouns are things like who. These are all-purpose, or rather, these are pronouns. If relative pronouns strictly are pronouns that are earmarked for relative clauses that occur in relative clauses. When we say the student who, the student whose, the book which, all of these WH words, even though we use them as question words in other sentences, we use them as relative pronouns in relative clauses, and it's legitimate to say they're relative pronouns. We also use the that form, the book that I was reading, and there's a huge discussion in English linguistics about when you use the that and when you use the WH forms and what the grammar is. And one thing you'll see in the literature, it's as like with many other rules that you'll see, that it's not right, people will tell you that there's an interesting difference in relative clauses in English and other languages. All the ones that we're talking about here are what we call restrictive. They're telling you which head noun we're talking about. That's the basic intuition. There is also a class of relative clauses, and you can see it clearly in English. Some languages are actually more restricted in terms of whether this is not a universal possibility, but many languages, particularly if you've got a post-nominal relative, will allow both restrictive and appositive relative clauses. Appositive, A-P-P-O-S-I-T-I-V-E. Consider the difference. Famous examples in the literature. The Eskimos who live in igloos have lots of fun. Versus the Eskimos, comma, who live in igloos, comma, have lots of fun. Do you hear the difference? The first one is restricted and is often paraphrased as those Eskimos, or the Eskimos that live in igloos, that subset of Eskimos that has the property of living in igloos that we've restricted, identified, those guys have lots of fun. For the rest, we're making no claim. We don't know. They probably don't have lots of fun. As opposed to the Eskimos, comma, who have lots of fun, or who live in igloos, have lots of fun. Doesn't matter which order you put it, the two are equivalent because in the appositive or parenthetical, you're making two claims about all Eskimos. The Eskimos, comma, who live in igloos, comma, have lots of fun. And so the appositive is not restricting the reference, it's simply adding an additional claim, an appositive, a parenthetical one. It's almost like saying the Eskimos, oh, by the way, they live in igloos, have lots of fun. Now, this possibility is not a universal possibility. Some languages have relative clauses, they don't allow the appositive. All what we're talking about is primarily, but the reason I mentioned this is because in English it's claimed, if you read a grammar of English, it's claimed that the difference between that and WH is crucially this, they claim. You can use, when you use the that relative pronoun, you can only do so in a restrictive relative clause. It cannot occur in an appositive. And if you think about it, there's something right about it. The Eskimos, that live in igloos, have lots of fun. That sounds a bit weird. We'd rather say the Eskimos who live in igloos, and so on. So there's something right, but what's not quite right about it is that there are some cases where you can also get the that in appositive relatives. You can get things like the box, that incidentally had jewels in it, was very valuable. And so with a head noun that's inanimate in English, you can actually get to that in a positive as well as restrictive relative clauses. So there's a subtle grammar here in particular languages. The crucial point to mention, we are talking in the typological context about restrictive relative clauses. Technically, when you talk about the English that, it isn't a relative pronoun. It's a general subordination marker of the kind we find in other languages. It's not technically a relative pronoun. And of course, it doesn't mark any case distinction. So back to our Hebrew. Hebrew, their equivalent word of the English that is Haisha, okay, the woman, She. Now, Sheyon, that John Natan gave La to her. Et, direct object marker, Hasefer, the book again. The woman that John gave the book to her. This is the crucial thing. This is what we call a pronoun retaining language, or another word you'll see in the literature, a resumptive pronoun language. You are putting in your relative clauses a little word pronoun that refers back to the head noun, the woman. And these are all over the place in Hebrew. The students that the professor taught them, the woman that I know, her, that they're saying this kind of stuff all the time. And this is a ubiquitous thing. These are called pronoun retaining languages. And the crucial point is that this is also for Keenan and Conry a plus case strategy, a case coding strategy. We have a nominal, the purpose of these pronouns is to make clear what role the head is playing in the relative clause. In this sentence, it's basically telling me that La is an indirect object that John gave to her. That's basically what it's telling me. So that's another strategy. A third way of being a plus case language is we do see in English, in addition to these relative pronouns, if you have combinations of, say, preposition and relative pronouns, so or complementizer as well. So in English, the professor to whom I sent the letter, or even if you strand the preposition, the guy that I went to the movies with, or the guy with whom I went to the movies. Keenan and Conry also consider these plus case strategies because although they're technically prepositional phrases, they include that under their idea of some nominal element that unambiguously tells you what the role of the head is. So the preposition is basically serving as a clue, as an anchor to the role of the preposition. I mean, you could technically leave it out. The woman that I went to the movies, some languages say that. And you don't have any explicit way of indicating, with or so on. So 3 ways of being plus case coding. Plus case
having a case mark relative pronoun, as in Indo-European, having a pronoun retention, as in Hebrew, having prepositions to indicate the place of the head, if your language does one of those things, then you are plus case. And if so, let's contrast that with what would be minus case. Well, for example, in those, say, you can see this in those dialects of English where you don't have any relative pronoun, you don't have any preposition, you don't have any resumptive pronoun. So there are many, in fact, my normal dialect of English, I say, the professor who wrote the book and the professor who I know. So it's who and who. So that would be a minus case strategy if your language doesn't make, at least for those subject and object positions. But in English, when we have the professor with whom I study, that would be plus case. And one thing Keenan and Conroy are going to do is to say, look, you've got to ask the question, are you plus case or minus case, for a particular strategy working on a particular position, relativizing on a particular position. So for those English dialects where you've got who for subjects, who for objects, they are minus case strategies. If you've got a who-whom distinction, you are a plus case language for those things. So basically, do you have some way of signaling using a nominal element, using a noun, using a pronoun, using a preposition combined with a noun? Do you have some way of signaling the role of the head? Now, of course, in English, even if we say, the reason we can get away with saying the professor who wrote the book and the professor who I know, the reason I can get away with that is because in English, the key indicator of the role of the head is verb position. The professor who wrote the book, or the professor who knows me, we've got subject, verb, object. Who knows me, so that who is the subject, knows is the verb, me is the object. The professor who I know, I've got who. Now, I know I immediately precedes the verb. I is the subject of the verb. So it's the different verb positions that tells me whether I'm relativizing on a subject or on an object. And some people have criticized the Keenan-Conroy typology and classification for saying, okay, it's all very well. You can classify languages according to whether they're plus case, minus case, but those aren't the only ways of making clear who does what to whom in the relative clause. You've got word order as an important thing, and one of the criticisms of the Keenan-Conroy classification is they should also include whether you've got verb marking, word order that tells you not just whether there's a nominal element, and a second factor that's highly relevant here, we're going to see it when we talk about some further languages, is verb agreement. In certain languages, you've got the agreement indicator, not just whether you've got some case marking on the noun that helps you to sort out who's doing what to whom, particularly in languages with rich verb. In fact, in a language like Basque, where you've got verb agreement markers on subject, when we talk about in the next section of the course, when we talk about case marking and verb agreement in detail, we're going to see there are certain languages that are what we call rich agreement languages, that not just like Spanish and Indo-European that have agreement with the subject. That's boring. There are languages that have subject mark agreement and object agreement, and they've got lots of little affixes on the verb that clue you in as to who's doing what to whom. Basque is such a language. It's got very rich verb agreement. And it's no accident that in Basque you can relativize on exactly the positions for which they have verb agreement markers, namely subject, object, and indirect object, and that's all you can relativize on. So clearly that's a relevant factor. So these are, if you like, remarks about the Keenan-Conroy typology isn't complete, but it's very good as far as it goes, and it gives us a nice handle on certain differences between languages. And we're going to see in just a second, we're going to see exactly what Keene and Comrie do with these notions and what their claim is. But just before we get into some of the details and before we take a break, if you can look at handout 1 and let's see their key claim, the famous claim in that paper, one of the most cited papers in the whole field of linguistics, along with, we're looking at some very cited papers, the Keene and Comrie accessibility hierarchy, just about everybody in grammar, in typology, in language acquisition, in psycholinguistic processing, just about everybody talks about this paper. It's a landmark study. It's the kind of thing where if you're doing a degree in linguistics, you absolutely positively have to read it, just like you have to read some Greenberg, just like you have to read some Chomsky, and you're not a complete linguist unless you do that. Here's the original claim. Let's look how it's formulated. We have what they call a hierarchy. So we have a ranking of positions. Subjects higher than DO. This is the original formulation. The direct objects, as I mentioned in the Comrie chapter, simplified it a bit. Let's look at the original formulation. Subject higher than DO, direct object higher than indirect object, IO higher than oblique, higher than genitive, and this last guy in the end, OCOM, it means the object of comparison. When you have sentences like John is bigger than Mary, and the issue is whether you can relativize on the object of comparison. Can you say things like the woman than whom John was bigger, or the woman who John was bigger than? In English, it's a little bit forced. You could just about do it, but they didn't actually have systematic data on that position, so that's kind of dropped out of the discussion since then. It's not terribly interesting. We're going to ignore it. But the top 5, and subsequently, as I mentioned, IO and oblique are collapsed because some languages don't systematically distinguish them in terms of their grammar, so syntax. So basically, we're dealing with a so-called accessibility hierarchy. And what was the basic intuition? Let's just look at the basic intuition, and when we come back from our little breather, we will look at some actual examples, some data, some. Can we move it down and just look at number 6? Here's the basic intuition that they started with, and all of this started actually with some field work that Ed Keenan did a number of years ago. He's fascinated by the language of Malagasy on the island of Madagascar. It's right next to Africa. It's not an African language. It's an Austronesian language. And he was fascinated by a number of Austronesian languages, which really led to this insight. What he noticed was, and we're going to see this in just a second, after the break, that so we have certain languages with very limited relativization possibilities. So one thing we're going to see is that in Malagasy, if you want to translate something like the professor who wrote the book, then it's easy. You can do it. But as soon as you venture down to say something like the professor whom I know, there is no literal direct translation of that relativization on an object or on any other position. What now is Malagasy some poor, impoverished language, and these guys are hobbling around sort of unable to express certain basic things? No. There are other ways of doing what they do in Malagasy. Malagasy, you'll remember, is a verb initial language. In fact, it's a VOS language, one of the rare ones is VOS, but it's very strongly verb initial. And one of the things we're going to see, and we'll see it repeatedly when we come to talk about case marking and verb agreement, in languages that are verb initial, they are very often verb-centered in one way or another. They will very often, most of them, have rich verb agreement. They will very often, and this is the case for the Austronesian languages, have a rich set of passive voices that will convert other parts of the sentence. Just like in English, if you want to say, the professor wrote the book, that's one way to do it. I can passivize and say the book was written by the professor. I can take the direct object, make it a subject. Now imagine a language that gives you 3, 4, 5 passive forms, each of which is promoting a different kind of non-subject into a subject position, so that as soon as you see the morphology of the passive verb, you know exactly whether you've passivized a patient, an instrument, a locative. You know exactly by looking at the verb what the grammatical role, what the thematic role, we say, is of that thing. So we're going to look at that in more detail when we talk about verb agreement, case marking, and so on. But just for the moment, only subjects in various languages can be relativized. In certain other languages, you can get a direct translation of subjects and objects, Kinyarwanda, Uganda, and so on. It's African languages. You can say things like the professor who wrote the book, the book which the professor wrote, but you can't make a literal translation of something like, the professor with whom I went to the movies, or something like that, or with whom I studied. So you can't do anything lower down. Then there's languages like Basque, where you can get literal translations of the professor who did something, the professor whom I know, direct object, the professor, to whom I gave the gift, or something like that, with very indirect. But you can't get anything like the professor with whom I did something, or the professor, next to whom I sat, or whatever. You can't get any other more oblique. And then you've got certain languages that allow the obliques, but they don't allow you to literally translate something like the boy whose book I was reading. They don't give you that equivalent of a genitive. And then there are languages like English and various others that, as we say, go all the way down the hierarchy. So this is the basic intuition was a rather brilliant observation. They collected a number of relative clauses. I said these are complex structures. Whenever you have complex structures, you find different languages cutting off as you get more and more sort of complexity. And what's very revealing about this is that we seem to have then a ranking of hierarchy, with subjects being the easiest thing that all languages can relativize, objects being the next, indirect objects the next, oblique the... And so what the cross-linguistic variation is giving you evidence for is increasing and decreasing complexity down these possibilities, with languages cutting off, not giving you direct translations of these things. And what we're going to do when we come back is see some actual examples of these, the Malagasy, the Kinyarwanda, and various others. And so we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll come back, and then we'll do another half hour or so, let you guys have a breather, recover, and then we've got 60 minutes for the midterm. So you're not totally flat out and exhausted. We will give you a 10-minute break and then do that. All set? Take a 5-minute break now, and we'll come back and do some more of this. So if you think of it in terms of the head, and it's a rather So they're all intended to those. That depends on the object.
In a way, it will be so now it's example.
Generally, yes. Quite present. Well, yeah. I mean, look, the way so it's quite rare.
I've gotten that out of those like things that I will like throw the words together.
Now,
I want to straight off
the
from together. Because when you
so
from together, it's just
start off
like I said, straight off.
pops over very conceptually. What can pop over from a record? Most people got pessimism. If one of those numericals from because we actually get gen now and now there. And only after that, in subsequent small numbers, we get gen. So then you get this dimensional global. And this one being less so you're not then going to get all of this. This SMB, this guy hopping over now and gen, now and still actually. And that's I think the logic in the so you could say, well, if you've got SOB and the genitive has hopped over, then you would expect the twos and the extras. So you won't get SOB now and gen and that will always. So that's the way to think about it. Think about it move,
You probably heard what he was saying. He was basically saying so please talk to me a little bit more about this difference between which analysis I'm going to do about
well, yeah, it's something more personal than general. So the Americans seem to like that. But again, I